Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. I want to welcome you to my class on social change in Appalachia. This class is going to help us understand social change in Appalachia using two clear historical case studies in West Virginia and in Eastern Kentucky. Learn to use qualitative categories to code examples of social change, and also use some theoretical perspectives and theories to help us predict what is going to happen and understand what is happening as we speak. Before we do that, however, I want to spend some time reintroducing you to the idea of Appalachia to make sure that you are thinking about the same Appalachia that I am. You know, I was raised in Appalachia and I identify as Appalachian, and it's kind of funny, but when I got to the university, I found out that the Appalachia that I had been taught existed wasn't exactly historically accurate. So I want to spend some time unpacking some of those ideas to make sure that we're both on the same page. We'll also get to some of the sticky issues happening in our region that we're going to revisit across the semester. You know, we got a lot to do in this course, and we got a lot to do today, so let's get started. I want to begin this class by sharing a quote from a sociologist who's very important, but is somebody that you probably never heard of, and that's George Vincent from the University of Chicago. We'll talk about George in a moment, but he gave this amazing quote that helps us understand why it's so important to study the Cumberlands, a term I'll explain in a moment, but also realize that we need to break apart some of the longstanding ideas that we have about that same region. Let me read this to you. Let students of sociology leave their books and at first hand in the Cumberlands deal with the phenomena of a social order arrested at a relatively early state of evolution. Wow, there is so much stuff that we got to unpack there. George Vincent was one of those important voices in rural sociology that we've kind of overlooked over the years. You know, he was someone that came into sociology when it was a very new field. It's really only 60, 70 years old, depending on how you want to measure those points. But he was an important part of the University of Chicago. He represents one of their early PhDs in sociology. And he was actually an author on one of the first textbooks, if not the first textbook in sociology, again, depending on how you want to define it. You know, he was an important scholar, but he was someone who saw social issues in a place he called the Cumberlands, which is, well, a region that we'll need to define. But he saw issues in Appalachia, and he knew that these were important issues that needed to be studied. You know, talking about undoing some of the things that we've learned about Appalachia, I didn't realize when I was a kid, but I actually grew up in the Cumberlands. I am from East Tennessee, and I didn't realize that was what we knew as the Cumberlands. In fact, I just called it Appalachia. But the Cumberlands include really the area that we're going to focus on in this particular class. That includes southwestern West Virginia, boy, that's a mouthful, eastern Kentucky, and also East Tennessee. For me, Appalachia was that plus western North Carolina. I didn't really think of Appalachia as being anything bigger than that. Boy, could I have not been more incorrect about that, though, because Appalachia really is a large cultural region that includes 13 different states from New York to Mississippi. It also includes over 400 counties and approximately 25 million people, give or take. That's a large swath of Appalachia, and it wasn't what I thought it was when I was a kid. Now, how do we get these definitions? Well, this is actually from the Appalachian Regional Commission, a name that'll come up more than once this semester. The ARC, or ARC as some people like to call it, is an official organization that kind of has helped define and understand social issues in Appalachia. And one of the things that they've done is actually broken down Appalachian into a couple of categories, ranging from northern, north central, central, south central, and to southern. Now, again, we're going to be thinking about the Cumberlands, which really is sort of central, north central Appalachia. We're going to be doing exactly what George Vincent has suggested here. I do want to share a fun fact that I just learned the other day. I didn't have anywhere else to put it but right here. Did you actually know, way back in 1839, there was actually a movement to rename America Appalachia? I was just absolutely stoked about that. I think that's really cool. So it was Washington Irving who wrote the story about Sleepy Hollow, the one with the headless horseman chasing people and Ichabod Crane and all that. It was a great Disney cartoon. I'm sure it's on the Disney Channel, maybe even YouTube. You can look it up. But he was the big sort of pushing force behind this idea of renaming America to Appalachia. Actually, Edgar Allan Poe, one of my very personal favorite writers when I was a kid, was also a big supporter. It turns out they were actually really good friends. It didn't really catch any traffic, but by like the Civil War, the idea had pretty much fallen off the table. But nonetheless, they felt that it really very much better explained how that we understood America, because at the time, the nation did more or less follow the Appalachian Mountain Range. Anyways, cool fun fact. Sounds like a really fun thing for a pop quiz, don't you think? For a class on social change in Appalachia, George Vincent's actually perfectly positioned. Circa 1900, there's a couple of really interesting cases of social change happening in Appalachia that kind of help tell much of the story that comes afterwards. Looking backwards, we can think about how the Civil War has dramatically changed its people, culture, and economy. For example, we see looking at the theaters of war for the Civil War, this overlapped with Appalachia's Shenandoah Valley and also a lot of guerrilla conflicts along the Georgia-Tennessee line. And these are devastating for the communities. Moreover, as slavery is banned and goes away, it dramatically changes the economy. Things like the agrarian farming communities aren't really working anymore. Sometimes they've been destroyed by all these guerrilla warfare issues, and sometimes they're just being abandoned or there's no one there to run them. What ends up happening is a lot of smaller farmers actually begin turning towards more predictable things that are very valuable, like untaxed liquor, moonshine. This is a whole thing too that's going to lead up to Prohibition era here in about 20 years. There's also a lot of post-reconstruction manufacturing stuff happening. Places like Pittsburgh, Knoxville, Chattanooga, out on the periphery of Appalachia, Atlanta and Birmingham are all now starting to have this manufacturing buzz about them, and people are moving to the area to help man these factories. And then on top of that too, we see that the coal industry and the timber industry and some other stuff is really starting to happen in the extractive industries. At this point, West Virginia's New River Gorge is in full production almost. It starts around 1873 in Hawks Nest, as I recall, and by 1900 is like really has spread through the New River Gorge, and actually is going to start declining here in about 10-15 years. So that's an exciting time. We can also think too about the timber industry here in the Red River Gorge, where I am. With the Red River Gorge, this was a large virgin wilderness that basically was untapped, and people were coming in and extracting all this lumber and sending it to other places, an idea we'll explore later in the lecture series. And this is kind of a fun fact too, but West Virginia ends up seeing the creation of the petrochemicals industry based on the production of ethylene in West Virginia and some of the areas that we're going to be talking about. So all this extraction, the manufacturing, the changes in the economy, all amazing things happening, even as George Vincent writes about the Cumberlands and Appalachia. All right, so before we get too far, I'm going to throw a timeout and just talk about this term Appalachia. Is it Appalachia? Is it Appalachia? All right, so funny story. Basically, if you're north of, say, like Washington, D.C., you're probably going to say Appalachia. And south of maybe like the West Virginia-Kentucky line, you're probably going to use Appalachia. Kentucky and West Virginia, sometimes they go both ways, but generally in eastern Kentucky, I hear Appalachia. Which one's correct? They're both fine. We can argue about that until we're blue in the face, but honestly, we need to come together and work to the betterment of Appalachia as a whole. So you can use whichever one you want. I grew up using the phrase Appalachia. That's what you're going to hear me say. The fun thing about Appalachia is that it really is this amazing, vibrant place that's honestly gotten kind of a bad rap. One of the things that we see even in George Vincent's quote is sort of proliferating these ideas of Appalachia as being this very backwards place. In fact, I love that sort of a lasting stereotype of Appalachia in the Cumberlands, as we think about it, is that it's an economically backward, rural, white region of Scots-Irish immigrants. And that is utterly flawed and incorrect. In fact, this was all stuff that I believed, again, as an Appalachian kid growing up, and it's just all wrong. So actually what I want to do is spend a couple of slides trying to unpack these ideas, think about them a little differently, and help you understand them. This is also a great spot for us to break from this lecture, and we'll pick up this idea in the next one. Now, if you got ideas about things you'd like me to talk about Appalachia this semester that I don't bring up, you leave them in the comments below. I'll be glad to do a video. If you also take a moment and subscribe to the channel, that'll make sure that you get all the updates on the videos and you get to hear them when they're released. That's all for the moment. In our next lecture, we're going to start really unpacking this idea of Appalachia and correcting some stereotypes that you may have that, well, they're not based in fact. Let's explore that later. I'll see you next time.